You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 498 of the podcast. And in this one, psychotherapist Jonny Say interviews me, Stuart Ralph. Jonny is a many-time guest on the podcast and also co-founder of the centre I run with him called the Integrative Centre for OCD Therapy. Now, we wanted to do this one as like a build-up to episode 500, which has been just shy of 10 years in the making. So we thought Jonny could interview me and ask me questions, and he asked me about the history of the podcast and some of my own personal history, how the podcast helped me in the early days of my recovery, and which topics and guests helped in particular, and then how the podcast has helped me as a therapist and the things I've learned, and much more. And thanks to our podcast partners, NoCD. If OCD is interfering with your life, NoCD can help. Their licensed therapists specialise in exposure and response prevention therapy, the most proven therapy for OCD. With NoCD, effective treatment that is 100% virtual is available for children and adults with OCD. And most members can get started within 7 days on average. No hassle, just real science-backed help and support between sessions. Begin your journey at nocd.com, or I'll put the link in the episode description. So thank you to Jonny for interviewing me. I appreciate his good questions and interview style. And of course, thank you to you guys for listening. As always, it means a lot, whether you listen to one episode or all of them. I deeply appreciate it. It's been a very long journey and only a couple now until episode 500. So thank you for listening to this. Without further ado, here is Jonny interviewing me. On the podcast today, I have Jonny Say, who has been on the podcast many times now. He obviously is the person I co-founded our centre with, the Integrative Centre for OCD Therapy. Only took me 2 years to say that fluently, but I'm proud I nailed it. So, but today, Jonny is going to interview me. Although if you listen to the intro, I'm sure I've already said that. So yeah, Jonny, I'll let you take the reins now and go ahead.
Great, Stu. Yeah, I had this thought that I remember hearing you describing some of the earlier podcasts, and that coincided with you working on your own OCD recovery, and it was making meaning out of your suffering. And, if I'm going through this kind of hell, I want it to be of service to others. So, your audience was obviously at the heart of it, but then you also shared that you were learning yourself. You wanted to get these people on, get experts, get recovery stories, inspiration onto the podcast in order for you to deepen your own recovery. And I thought that was really interesting. And then there's this sort of journey with the podcast that seems very relevant given you're fast approaching 500 episodes, but this journey towards becoming a therapist yourself, and then the podcast still having the audience at the heart of it, and thinking about your listeners as the key focus, but then also what can I learn from my clients, what can I learn from therapists in order to deepen my OCD therapy skills and practice. So I thought that's a fascinating journey, and I wanted to pick your brains on some of that early time. What were some of the important messages you picked up, and then into that later time as well? So I've got some questions, some ideas, but yeah, that was my thinking. So I guess what I wanted to ask you to begin with was, I'd love to have an idea of, again, where your head was at when you first set up this podcast. You were obviously, working on your own recovery. You dealt with some very intense OCD, some really tough times. Could you give us a little picture of where you were at when you decided to make the podcast, started and did those first episodes?
Yeah, my head was everywhere, really, very deep into rumination. At that point? It might have been just after that. There's just a clear memory in my head of just being at my desk. This is before I retrained as a therapist, And I just remember just staring at the screen for long periods of time each day, completely zoning out, feeling completely sort of hopeless. I wasn't suicidal or anything at that point, but I just felt numb. And there were times my manager at the time, good on her, she really noticed and kind of pulled me aside and stuff. But I just remember being gripping on to anything I could really to keep going, just day to day, keep going. And so that's kind of where I was at. I was, like I said, I wasn't suicidal. I was down, but I wasn't depressed at that point, luckily. Um, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I had a will to keep going, but it was just like hopeless, I guess. It felt hopeless. And I was just in my head ruminating constantly about the things I was obsessing about. At that time, both real event and relationship OCD were the two themes that were occupying my mind. So yeah, and then it was like I said, you've highlighted wonderfully. I've said many times about remember sitting on the bed, feeling lost. Lost might be better than hopeless, a word for me at that time. I was just very, very lost, and just thinking I have to do something. Just well, no, I think I'd almost at that point felt like I wasn't going to get better. This I didn't see. I'd done some therapy at that point, not a great deal, but some. And I just felt like if it was getting better, it was going to take a long, long time, or it wasn't going to get better at all. Actually, I must have thought it was going to get better over time because otherwise more depression would have come in or lower mood. But I did feel like this wasn't changing anytime soon. And then that's when it was like, well, that's where like my reading had kicked in from big into self-development at that point in my life. And Man's Search for Meaning, written by Viktor Frankl. That was a hard read emotionally, but it really left a mark on me in terms of finding meaning in suffering and transforming suffering and all of that. So that's where that kicked in, I think, on the edge of that bed, just having that epiphany, dare I say, of, well, if I'm going to suffer, someone else might as well suffer less off the back of my suffering. So, my suffering might as well have a purpose. And that's what then kicked in my creative brain. And then I was thinking constantly for, several days or weeks, what could I do? What's the problem that could be fixed here? And in doing the podcast was somewhat of a savior. One, I think it helped me speed up my recovery because I got a lot of answers quicker doing it, increased my network dramatically, which again helped me with information and community. But that sense of purpose and obligation that I had to release an episode every week was my anchor. We talk about dropping anchor as an axe skill. At that point, the podcast, it doesn't anchor me anymore. It doesn't need to. But back then, it was huge. It gave me a reason to keep going in the midst of pain. And I was lacking that up to that point. So.
Yeah, that's so powerful to hear. And you were in a really tough place, and yet you tried to help others. And that must have been difficult doing those first podcasts, sort of dealing with the intensity of what you were going through. And gosh, hasn't it been a benefit to everyone since? And I guess that was 2015, right? Um, Around that sort of time was when you started, wasn't
Yeah.
it? 2015.
It started off as a website for people's stories. And that was August 2015. And then the first podcast was December the 4th or 6th or 5th, 2015.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and you got some incredible guests on very quickly, and I was trying to think where how I discovered OCD stories when I was struggling, and I think it must have been through the John Hirschfield link because I was a big fan of John Hirschfield's, the a mindfulness workbook for OCD, and was getting a lot of inspiration from his work. And I must have just been, I don't really remember discovering podcasts, to be honest. I must have been listening to some by that point and must have somehow discovered it. And I think that was my route in. And then some of those early ones for me, I guess I'd been going through some therapy. I'd had sort of therapy in 2013, and I'd started kind of ERP 2013, 14, 15, around that sort of time. So I was starting to feel better in my own recovery to some degree. And then I must have discovered your podcast around that time. And I remember it just inspired me, and it built upon what I was working on with my own difficult OCD thoughts and feelings. And, people like Steve Hayes, and, as I've said, Hirschfield, and I remember Charlotte Nicely, some of those early ones, Reed Wilson, other people you had on, were so inspiring to me at that time. And they were the things I was turning to sort of motivate myself to keep going and to keep doing what I was doing. So for me personally, it was huge. But I'm just really intrigued, like, do you have any kind of learnings that you got from those, from the beginning of the podcast and those sort of earlier phase of the podcast, where it was about, partly about your own learning and growth? I'm wondering what sort of messages stood out to you from your guests.
Yeah, so I think from after about a year of the podcast, I then started to retrain my sort of therapy journey. But that first year, 2 years was very much still more about, it was about the listeners, but it was about me. So I was asking questions from what I needed to find out and what I needed in my own healing. And then it was always, if anyone wants to listen, actually, then great. But I think it came about the listeners actually quicker than I'm saying. But yeah, in the early days, it was very much like, I need answers. And if anyone wants to listen, that's amazing, because I didn't expect people to listen. But I was very much asking maybe questions more as a person with OCD, as a sufferer, and then having the listeners in mind. Whereas now when I ask questions, I'm asking it more as a therapist first, sufferer second. I'm still asking them with the listener in mind, but I'm just thinking from a therapist point of view. Or I'm thinking like, what do I need to know from this guest about a client I'm having a tough time with, helping? And I might ask a question on that. So it's useful. But yeah, in those first couple of years, it was very much asking questions from me as a sufferer's perspective for the listener. And yeah, like one of the things that really helped me was obviously ACT. Hence, I had Steve Hayes on, and, one of the founders of ACT, in episode 4, I believe. So he was on my radar from the get-go. It was great to have him on, even though I didn't understand ACT that well at that point. I understand the concept enough. So getting him on was huge. And it was also huge from my self-worth perspective, like for him to come on that early when I had released like 2 episodes. I may not even release the 3rd episode at that point, because obviously we record ahead of time. And that gave me a big boost that he came on, says so, because I know he doesn't waste his time, so that meant a lot. As did actually Bob Berg, who I think was episode number 2. Bob Berg is an author that I had read. He's written many books. He's got OCD, and he wrote The Go-Giver, I think it's called, which is a really good book for anyone in business about going above and beyond, giving more, being helpful. And then that always comes, I say always, often comes back to you, So that book, I always loved that book from my sort of marketing days. So it's great to get him on again. That gave me a boost of confidence. And like, Mark Freeman was number 1, the first guest. His videos, when I was really struggling, his videos on YouTube, his early videos were like really helpful for me. The concepts, the way he simply and articulately expresses a point, often from ACT, was super helpful when I was really struggling. So to have him on as guest number 1 was really cool. And then on ACT again, Chad Lejeune, he was one of my early guests. He's obviously been on in the last couple of years maybe for his newer book. So again, getting people like Chad on around ACT was really good. So yeah, ACT generally taught me to not take my thoughts so seriously, accept the presence of them, make space for them, all of this, which now I can, trained in ACT, I can not articulate that more. But at the time, it was just the simple concept of making space, accepting thoughts and feelings, getting some distance from them. Those just simple understandings were really helpful for me. It later on took the skills for me to really implement it, but it gave me a good starting block. Then I put Pete Wise down. Pete was like episode, maybe not, around 12, 7, something like that. He's been on several times. Pete helped me set up the camp here in the UK, the OCD camp, which was through the podcast. Now it's through our centre. You obviously been a part of the camp several times now. You've seen how kind of impactful it is and just special it is. And so it's just something about him coming on, talking about the camp in that early episode. I'm a big fan of nature in the sense of being in it, being around it, the benefits of it to us. So just something about having him on, and he's someone I respect very much. And so I just wanted to mention. And again, him investing in me, saying, if you ever want to do it, I don't know if he said it on the episode or like when we were just chatting before or after, I'll come and help you. And then later on for him to come and help me, very much on his own dime, basically. Again, I really respect, and it put belief in me. A lot of this, you'll notice there's themes of people believing in me, which I think was so important for the longevity of the podcast. Generally, in that first year, there was a lot of people like Reed Wilson, you've mentioned, Charlotte Nicely, Jeff Bell, Fred Penzel, John Grayson. Many of those are doctors, so I haven't mentioned that, but yeah. They covered a lot of the foundations of ERP, and that really helped me learn. I'd done some of it already, but that helped me get an even deeper understanding of ERP, especially the more traditional way of doing it. Although obviously I think Reed will say he's not an ERP therapist. He has his own kind of approach, but obviously is very exposure-like.
And very act-like. He's often said the closest thing to what he's doing is act, and I've heard him say on interviews and things.
Yeah. But this kind of dealing with uncertainty, all of that is really, really helped me in that early year or so. And then the end of year one, I got Kieran O'Connor on, who was one of the founders of IBT, then now called ICBT, inference-based CBT. And it was just inference-based therapy, I believe, before. Same thing, though. I believe it was just a name change. Anyway, so I think reason I put that down was he was a really nice guy. He sadly passed away. But that, I think, when I was looking back at my records of episodes, realizing that actually that was a big shift in me looking beyond just ERP and being open-minded and covering lots of other topics. Although I think prior to that, I'd done an episode on psychedelics, someone sharing that. And so that was always in me to be open-minded. It's very much in my nature and curious. But I think from a therapy point of view, Kieran marked a kind of key transition there. Where's my notes gone? And then also I think between year 1 and 2, or maybe in year 1, I can't remember, I got like Paul Gilbert on from Compassion Focused Therapy, Professor Paul Gilbert. And then which CFT is a big part of what I do now. And like Donald Robertson from a stoicism point of view, like again, getting a stoic on to talk about that side of things was sometimes I don't think it fully fit, but sometimes it's important for me to look beyond the everyday, stay interesting. And then the last thing I'll say is in year 2, was when I got Chrissy on, actually. So I met her in San Francisco, Chrissy Hodges, at the ISDF conference in 2017, and she won the Hero Award. And then I met her there, and then I got her on the podcast pretty shortly after. So I think meeting Chrissy and then all the other advocates, a lot of time through her and her events, really blew up my social connection within the community and connection with other advocates, and that community has been deeply beneficial to me as a human being and the growth of the podcast. So I just wanted to shout her out. So those were the kind of five things. I mean, there's tons, but those are the five things that jumped out at me.
Yeah, and we're not meaning to leave anyone out of
No.
this. Obviously, every guest has been important, and you've had, so much we couldn't fit it into an episode, but we're just trying to pick some of the themes. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That was certainly, I was listening to all the ACT stuff and really getting a lot from it. And, I think we've talked before, Mark Freeman was very inspirational to me and actually very supportive. I mean, he was one of the many professionals during my um, compulsive emailing days that I was emailing, and he was, gave some fantastic advice and things that really inspired me to sort of work. And his videos are, very, very helpful ways of articulating ACT in quite a unique way for OCD. And but yeah, then obviously the Steve Hayes, the Paul Gilbert, those episodes were huge for me as well. And I remember the Stoic one was a powerful one actually, and obviously Stoicism has grown in popularity, and lots of people are resonating with that as a philosophy now. Um, and I remember the episodes with Chrissy, and I was just blown away. Chrissy and Aaron as well, Aaron Harvey, just
Yeah.
the honestness about their intrusive thoughts. And for me, as someone who had lots of harm and, the taboo OCD themes and things when I was younger, the thought of sharing them, I was blown away when I first heard them talking openly about those experiences. And it really, it still inspires me to this day massively whenever I hang out with Chrissy and collaborate with her and stuff. I'm blown away by her courage and her honesty. And, so it's lovely that yeah. And seeing you when we've spent time with the advocate community, the Game Changers stuff and the ISDF conference and other conferences and things, you can see that has you've bonded very deeply with those people through the shared experience of pain, making meaning out of the pain, and they've helped, you grow in your self belief, right? People believe in me, you mentioned, and it sounds like that is, that's been something that has increased your self belief, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And like that sense of community, like you mentioned Aaron. Yeah, I love Aaron. So I wasn't going to mention him in my list because obviously I didn't meet him until I think after the 2 years.
Yeah,
But like there's so many people that won't get mentioned today that are deeply important to me and I value
yeah,
highly, like Aaron, Sean Shinnick, Margaret Sisson,
yeah.
Chris Johnson, you name it. It's an infinite amount of people.
Yeah, we can't name everyone individually. We're just pulling out some of those key themes. So, and where were you discovering some of these people early? Was that your own online research and books and things like that, or how were you coming across these OCD specialists and experts?
Yeah, so like for example, like Mark through YouTube. I can't remember how I came across Stephen Hayes. I obviously read something of his or saw something of his and knew he was the founder of ACT and thought, okay, it'd be cool to interview him, not expecting to get a response, obviously.
Mm,
Again, Bob Berg, I think I'd seen he'd maybe tweeted about OCD or something, and I thought, oh, I've read his book and reached out to him. And then it kind of tiptoed from there. Like Pete was because I saw the documentary Extreme OCD Camp.
mm, mm.
Terrible title, but he didn't come up with that. That was the TV production company, I believe, just sensationalizing it. But great documentary nonetheless. And so I saw that on YouTube, and then that's how I reached out to him. So it was little things like that, things I saw, read. And then as time went on, it was like, oh, people might say, oh, you should interview this person, or a guest might say, oh, my colleague, does this, you might enjoy speaking with them, or that was it. Really, Twitter was, I think, a big part of those early days, connecting through that as well.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and then now I did have a form on the website. It's temporarily closed just because I'm like 18 months behind reading the applications because I can only invite a certain amount at a time. otherwise my calendar would be booked up for like 3 years of recordings, and there's no point in booking someone in 3 years away because their circumstances might change. And so, but then also, I'll get past guests on, obviously, because I have connection with them and there's more I want to hear from them, or I, just want to catch up with them. Or, you might say, I met so-and-so, you should, da, da, da. Or sometimes at conferences, I'll meet people and be like, oh yeah, do you want to come on? Or if, like I said, something comes up in my clinical work or I'm a bit stuck, I might think, oh, maybe I can invite a guest to talk about that topic. And then I'm indirectly learning and helping my client. If it's relevant for my client, it's probably going to be relevant for many other people. So those are kind of the key ways. And rarely, I mean, I do get quite a lot of PR people reach out. For example, a PR person reached out for Braden Smith, the NFL offensive tackle, I think he is. And I thought, yeah, that's great. He's a perfect fit for the podcast. He's got a platform. So I got him on. So rarely I'll take things from PR people just because a lot of the time they're just not doing their research and they're just trying to get their celebs or athletes or whoever on as many platforms as possible. But Braden was very targeted, so I was more than happy to have him on. He was a good guest.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then you started your own training and training as a therapist and continued the podcast. And then I'm interested in how it transitioned into that focus alongside your audience that you'd grown and connected with and built, but also the focus on clients and deepening your understanding. I guess maybe I'd be interested in you making that decision to become a therapist and then how that interacted with the podcast and the guests you were choosing and the learning points there.
Yeah. So it was a natural thing for me to become a therapist because, and I think I've told this story before, but when I was academically, I really, really struggled at school. I think I didn't have dyslexia, but I did do basically I don't know what it was, educational psychologist type assessment, and they basically say one side of your brain is working fine, the other side is working too quick, which sounds great. But it just meant at times I'd make tons of spelling mistakes, whereas I could go back and I could see my errors, but in the moment it made no sense because one brain was thinking quicker than the other was right. I don't know, whatever it is. I wish I still had the report because I could understand it now or better. So that was at university. I got that help. And then I got extra time in exams and all this other stuff, and that really helped. And I got a B at undergraduate, or a merit in the UK. And, I don't think I got a single B in the entire time in secondary school, which is 11 years old to 16. And then 16 to 18 at A-levels, I got 2 E's and a D. So, so for me to get a B at university level showed you something had turned around. And also I was passionate finally about something I was learning. Before, education just seemed completely irrelevant and forced. And so I really, really struggled at school. I think it was literally called like special needs classes back then. Obviously, probably not called that anymore. I know it's like SEND, special education needs, now, but that was quite stigmatizing for me. And I always had extra help in primary school, elementary school, reading, writing. I was often taken out of class, all of that. So, and I think that is that kind of natural, the way my brain was working. But I think also OCD had a big part to play in that. I was just ruminating. I know I had handwriting compulsions looking back, which took me ages to write an A4 sheet of paper, whereas my peers had written 3 or 4 in the same amount of time. And I was anxious a lot and all of this. Anyway, so I remember being interviewed for like a mock interview by a volunteer that came into the school, and they said, this is when I was like 15, they said, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to be a psychologist. And I don't know why I said that to this day, but at the time when I said it, it felt as true as could be in my heart, so to speak, or my gut, or whatever it was. It just felt right. And I felt certain about it. And for me at the time, psychologist meant, because psychologist can mean many things, but for me at the time, it meant just a therapist. So I wanted to be a therapist. And then when I went to pick my A levels at 16, I'd obviously done terrible at GCSEs, which is, I'm explaining this because obviously Americans, for example, or maybe Canadians, they have different systems to us. And the teacher wasn't trying to be mean, but she was saying it because she cared. She didn't want me to struggle. But she said, look, if you do psychology and sociology, which was two of the A levels I wanted to do, she said, you're really going to struggle because these are hard A levels. So because I was quite passive and timid, I didn't really push back and say, F that, I'm going to do them anyway. And I didn't have the confidence in myself. So I'm not criticizing myself. I was who I was and I was struggling. And I now know, although she was caring, actually what she should have said is, are you really passionate about this? And if the answer is yes, then you'll be okay. Because when I got to uni and then my several master's degrees that I have now, the struggle has made me step up because I cared about it. I was passionate about it. And to this day, if I do anything that I'm not passionate about, it's getting half-assed. It's not getting done. And I'm not doing that intentionally. And that was the same in school. I just didn't care. So yeah, I guess I'm just sharing that for any teachers of, if they're passionate, let them struggle, because then they'll find a way most of the time. I can't guarantee that. Anyway, but in hindsight, I don't regret it. I think it all worked out. And it wasn't until, I was 28 when I started the podcast ish, anyway. And I'd been huge into self-development all through my 20s, which was my attempt at psychology and improving myself and understanding my mind and all of this. And I'd always wanted to help people and all of that. So then, yeah, when I started the podcast about 6 months in, I was like, oh, I know what I have to do. I have to go back and retrain. So then I did a conversion master's because I didn't have an undergrad in psychology and blah, 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 blah. And here we are today. So I'm really glad I did it. It wasn't easy. But I think actually going through that windy journey and having a career in marketing and all of that helps me to this day. One, it helps me run the centre with you. It helped me promote the podcast. It helped me have a level of professionalism that I bring when working with parents and stuff now. All of these things are deeply useful. And I think I needed to go through about 8 years of therapy before I was someone who was safe enough to be a therapist in front of other human beings. Because I wasn't who I needed to be at 21 if I'd come out of a degree and gone straight into being a therapist, psychologist, whatever. I'm not saying I would have done bad things, but I think a lot of my own shit would have been coming out and I wouldn't have been aware of it.
And you might have gotten overwhelmed and burnt out and other things happening. Yeah. Mm.
So I'm glad it took as long as it took. Obviously I wasn't glad in the moment, but in retrospect, it worked as it needed to work.
And how was it navigating retraining whilst doing the podcast? That must have been tough if any deadlines overlapped with trying to get podcasts out and things, or was it okay? Could you manage that?
Yeah, it was a bit of both. It was a struggle at times, but the beauty's in the struggle, to be a cliche. And I'm pretty, when it comes to academics, when I care about it, I'm pretty organized and efficient. I'm often not. That's the thing. Through having to juggle all these things over the last 10 years, I've become way more efficient and organized. Whereas I wasn't. Growing up, I was a mess. I was everywhere. My brain naturally wants to run around everywhere, and I've had to learn systems, ways of being, ways of scheduling. All of that has made me way more effective as a human being in life and business and whatever else. So no, I just had to have systems in place and it was manageable. But yeah, there were times obviously where I was up super, super late or early hours of the morning, and would I want to do that now? No way. But in my 20s, it was okay, and early 30s. And, I might have been worse than that, but it's not coming to my mind because I'm probably repressing it.
The positivity bias looking back, but yeah. And then in terms of key learnings, then again, what stands out for you as you were at, from that stage of being a therapist and learning from experts and stuff you took in to your client work?
Yeah, so I mean, just on a top line level thing, my question has definitely changed because I mean, when I was training, I was when I had clients as a trainee, I wasn't really working with OCD people. Typically, they were everyone with everything going on, and so it didn't really help me in that sense. But I think at that point, if I were to look back at the timing, I would probably find more episodes generally about therapeutic relationships or other stuff or compassion or stuff that would have linked to those clients too. And then as I became private practice, worked more with OCD, more exclusively, or higher percentage. Yeah, it's them thinking about my clients. How can I address them? Or maybe I've seen stuff in my clients. I've also had a few people maybe reach out and I'm like, okay, there's a theme here that I need to address in the podcast. But yeah, but then in terms of guest specifics, I pulled out a few things. So again, every episode, as you said earlier, I learned something new. One is obviously Dr. Phillipson. He's been on the podcast, I think, more than anyone. You're gaining on him, but I think he's
I'm coming for you, Steve.
Yeah, he's still got the lead. I don't think he listens to the podcast, but
No, I know. Especially not this one. Yeah.
well, if he's going to listen to anyone, it would be my one. But no,
Of course,
yeah. So yeah, a couple of things that Steve said. Again, I like how Steve simply lays out behavior therapy and ERP. I think it's really easy for people to get their heads round. He communicates ideas very simply. And I think that's important in a world where information can be overwhelming, especially when people are in their downstairs brain and they're overwhelmed. You don't want, someone who's just using way too many words, or syllables. So irrelevance. Steve often talks about this idea of irrelevance, sending that brain signal in our brain, the OCD brain signal, that the signal it's given us is irrelevant, and he talks often about how you do that. Obviously ERP naturally doing that, but like leaning into it, maybe joking with the brain, lots of different ways. But just trying to show that that's just a thought and I don't need to pay attention to it, I think is a really nice concept, this idea of irrelevance. And I always think about what are we teaching our brain within, when we do a compulsion, we're telling the brain this worry is important to me, give me more of it. Okay, we ideally don't want more of it. So how do we cut down on the compulsions? Just being very, very simple about it. So just what am I teaching the brain through my behavior, if we think in purist behavior terms? So I like the term irrelevance. He also talks a lot about choice. And in that article he wrote, there's something like no word more important in recovery than the word choice. It might even be broader than that, but it's something like that. And I think I really like that one because he's emphasizing that we always have agency. Again, I use any set terms loosely. In generally speaking, we always have agency. And I think with OCD, you feel like you don't have control, you don't have agency, the OCD is dominating you. And this is all a lie. That part of our brain is communicating to us because it actually wants to keep us safe. That's why it's anxious, but it's overprotective and it needs to chill out. But we always have a choice, to listen, to do a compulsion, to not do a compulsion, even if it feels like we don't, because often OCD will tell us we don't. Or the stakes are too high if we don't do the compulsion. It'll go down all that route. And I think choice also reminds us that behavior changes. When we change our behavior, things change most of the time. Again, I don't want to say all of the time, most of the time. And I don't mention Greenberg in this, I guess I am now, but obviously he talks a lot about agency, again, of you always have control, even if you feel you don't. I'm paraphrasing him.
And recovery is about exercising that
Yeah.
agency and choice. It is a similar message they have, I think,
Yeah,
in
it's an
that. Yeah.
empowering one. It's an empowering
Mm,
one. And I think for people in the thick of it, it can feel like, well, I don't, and that's demoralizing. And I think you do. You just need help seeing it, working with it. And I think that's where like ACT comes in. So on
mm.
that, and again, we got training with Phillips and any therapist listening. I'll put a link in the show notes, but it's on the centre website where he'll talk a lot about a lot of this and certain ERP tools and skills. So Russ, sorry, not Russ, well, Russ Harris, Dr. Russ Harris, but the ACT was a big thing I really emphasized as I went through my training. I was doing continuous professional development trainings on ACT for myself as a therapist. So I got more people like Russ Harris on, who really, I mentioned earlier, Steve Hayes and all of that was really good for me in understanding ACT. And then I really like Russ's approach as to you on the skills he's developed around implementing ACT. So getting him on and understanding ACT more generally with my other guests, and we've talked about it a lot together on the podcast, was a big thing for me as a therapist because I really wanted to grapple with ACT more and get it more. So even though I was learning ACT, then obviously getting Russ on two or three times now, I think, helped me, ask questions that I couldn't quite get from his trainings or his book, or I could then ask those. And I did a live training with him in London actually this year with Alex from our centre. And that was really cool, even though he was covering a lot of the things I'd already learned from his trainings. Just doing it in person helped cement certain learnings for me. Story episodes, I want to just give a nod to them. Yeah, as I became a therapist, so I emphasized that much more, the story episodes, because I learn as much from people's stories as I do from any expert. The story episodes help me understand my clients better, my listeners better, help me spot nuances. It also helps me pick up strategies. It also reminds me things that I was forgetting in my own recovery, or to talk about with my clients. So it would jog my memory. So I want to acknowledge those people and thank them. I also went into ERP in more detail, really understanding just the traditional views of ERP and inhibitory learning and all of that. So tons of guests within that category. And that's something I'll continue to do because it's such an important therapy for OCD. But I think, really understand the nuances. And I maybe went more into the specific themes within ERP, like themes of OCD. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight was I did a lot more on compassion. So alongside training a lot in ACT, I trained a lot in compassion-focused therapy or CFT. So obviously, historically, I had Paul Gilbert on, who's the founder of CFT. Obviously, you, Jonny, you talk a lot about compassion. Kim Quinlan. Laurie Johnson doesn't actually talk about compassion, but I deem her very compassionate. So whenever I'm in her presence, in person or on the podcast, I kind of pick that up. Shiva Rajai, again, same sort of thing. It's not actually talking about compassion, but her very being emits that. Then you've got like Marissa Mazza, Nicola Petrocchi, and tons of other that talked about compassion. And then not necessarily compassion, but like Nate Gruner and Megan Cleary, who, again, we did a training at the centre with, but they've been on the podcast, and they were talking about functional analytics psychotherapy, which I love. I find really fascinating. But their way of being and FAP itself, in how they deliver it at least, is deeply compassionate, but they're not really talking about compassion. So yeah, just exploring compassion, whether it's directly talking about compassion, whether it's compassion focused therapy, whether it's being around therapists who are very compassionate, or whether it's like a different therapy that in theory has nothing to do with compassion, but it's deeply compassionate at its core, like FAP. That's something I've really gone into because that didn't come easy for me as a sufferer, compassion and being compassionate for others. I always felt compassion for others, but saying it and that sort of stuff was harder for me. So learning this stuff helped give me the language to communicate how I naturally felt better with people. And that's still very much a work in progress for me as an individual and for my clients. as a therapist.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Yeah, I think such a fascinating journey, so many important messages and themes. I think if anyone listening took notes of all those core areas, went and explored those episodes, went and practiced those skills, and went deeper on ACT, on ERP, on compassion, on FAP, um, that's a lot of the building blocks for a strong recovery and improving your mental health with OCD. So thank you for walking us through that. And thank you for your, courage to put this out there and to put all this time and commitment into such a fantastic podcast, which I know for me was incredibly helpful and supportive at times when I was struggling and going through difficulties. And, over and over, people will tell me, it's been a lifesaver and how important it has been. And it's so incredibly moving to meet with the people that, it really has held them through difficult times, has put them on the right track for therapy approaches that have been helpful, inspired and supported recovery. And just thank you so much for all your hard work on that. And, it's been an honor to chat with you about it all. So thanks, Stu.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Jonny. And obviously appreciate your friendship and support over the years. It's been like 7 now, I think. And obviously being a repeat guest, it's been good. And yeah, thanks for the interview today. It's always nice to speak and share. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate all that too. And yeah, we bonded at an OCD. We met and connected and bonded at an OCD Stories event. I came and chatted to you, and we became friends from there. So, yeah, it's definitely been a huge value to me. So, thank you again. And yeah, brilliant.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, you can click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.